Hello, and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we are not here for the grand pronouncements of textbooks or for the sudden, sharp, and startling turns of fate that define our waking world. We are here instead for the long, quiet, and unfolding echo of the past. We are here for the stories that unspool with the slow, steady, and gentle pace of a darkening evening. Stories that ask nothing of you but to listen. Find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders settle. Feel the tension in your jaw release, and allow your body to feel the full support of the surface beneath it. There is nothing required of you here. Nothing to solve, nothing to analyze, and nowhere else to be. You are safe in the profound and quiet comfort of your modern room, a place of soft fabrics, still air, and predictable warmth. You are a world away from the lives we are about to visit. Our journey tonight takes us back to a time when life itself was a far more precarious, fragile, and unpredictable thing. The very act of living, of moving through the world, was fraught with small, intimate dangers that we, in our well-lit and well-ordered age, have long since forgotten. The ground beneath one's feet, the air one breathed, the light one used to see, all held a quiet, constant potential for disaster. We will begin our journey there, in the simple, physical realities of a world made of stone and wood and open flame. We will explore how human ingenuity, so often sparked not by foresight, but by human tragedy, slowly began to sand down the sharpest and most dangerous edges of daily life. From this physical world, a world of texture, sound, and smell, we will drift into a place enclosed by high stone walls. Here, the dangers were not to the body, but to the soul, to the heart. We will visit the medieval convent, and we will listen to the whispers in the cloister, exploring a world of hidden passions, profound faith, and impossible, heartbreaking choices. And finally, we will settle into the tragic and deeply human stories of kings and queens, whose crowns and castles offered no protection from the whims of the heart, or from the relentless, grinding, and indifferent gears of history. Let your breathing slow. Let it find its own easy rhythm. Let the noise and the concerns of the present day fade, replaced only by the sound of my voice. There is only the story and the quiet, gentle invitation to sleep. The perils of the medieval world. Let us picture a castle. We will not picture it as a fortress bracing for the tumult of war, with banners flying and trumpets sounding. Let us instead picture it as a home, a very large and complex home at the end of a long, ordinary, and tiring day. As twilight settles, the great stone walls, which have absorbed the faint, pale warmth of the afternoon sun, now begin to radiate a damp, penetrating chill. The air grows heavy, and from below the ramparts, rising with the evening mist that clings to the ground, comes the smell of the moat. It is not the clear, sparkling water of a fantasy painting. This is not a picturesque, romantic feature. This water is still. It is stagnant. It is choked with thick, green-brown algae, with tangled reeds, and with the greasy, iridescent scum of daily life. The moat is the final destination for almost everything the castle needs to discard. It is the repository for the kitchen's waste, bones, spoiled food, and grease. It is the endpoint for runoff from the stables, and in many cases, it is the open sewer for the castle's privies, the garderobes, which are little more than stone chutes built into the outer walls. And so, the smell is one of damp, decomposing earth, of sulfur, of decay, and of a profound, stagnant stillness. It is the smell of a forgotten, watery grave, a smell so constant that the castle's inhabitants have long since ceased to notice it. In theory, this muddy, fetid ring was a marvel of defense. It was designed to stop invading armies, to prevent enemies from tunneling under the walls, and to make those high stone walls unassailable by siege towers. But in the quiet, repetitive rhythms of daily life, the moat was a far more present and far more intimate danger to those who lived within the walls.
There is a servant, a young woman, sent to fetch water from a cistern near the outer wall, or perhaps to empty a bucket of waste over the edge, long after the sun has set. There is no electric light, no glowing screen, no flashlight to guide her path. There is only the flickering, unreliable glow of a single torch held in an iron sconce far down the corridor. Its light casts shadows that twist and dance, turning familiar shapes into monstrous, moving forms. The path is uneven stone, perhaps slick with a recent rain, or with the mud and grime tracked in by the guards.
The moat is a black, silent, invisible void, its edge completely indistinguishable from the shadow of the wall. One misplaced step, one moment of imbalance while carrying a heavy wooden bucket, and the servant is gone. There might be a single short cry, a muffled splash, and then silence. She is pulled down not by an enemy, not by a soldier, but by the simple, heavy weight of her wet wool dress and the sudden, shocking, breathless cold of the water. Or picture a knight, a nobleman, returning from a long banquet in the great hall. His belly is full of spiced wine and roasted meat. His mind is thick and slow from the drink and the oppressive heat of the fire. He is encased in 60 pounds of polished steel armor, a walking fortress who is, in this precise moment, hopelessly, fatally vulnerable. He navigates his way across the dark courtyard, his metal-soled boots scraping and echoing on the cobblestones. He misjudges the turn onto the narrow drawbridge. He stumbles, and he topples over the edge. There is no dog paddling in full plate armor. There is no frantic splashing. There is only a great crashing sound, a metallic thud, followed by a deep splash, and then a frantic, muffled bubbling as the water floods the narrow breathing slits in his helmet. And then a heavy, final silence. The moat, the castle's great protector, has claimed another of its own. These were not rare occurrences. They were a tragic and predictable part of life, the accepted cost of living in a fortress. Swimming was not a common skill, especially not for a commoner or a man encased in steel. And rescue, in the pitch black, was often little more than shouting and pointing, a futile gesture of panic in the dark. Eventually, after so many friends, so many servants, so many children, and even so many drunken nobles were lost to that still, dark, unforgiving water, the first simple safety features began to appear. These were not grand innovations. They were not strokes of genius. They were reactions born of grief, frustration, and necessity. A rope, thick and bristly with hemp, was strung between two wooden posts along a particularly dangerous, uneven stretch to provide a handhold. A simple wooden railing, crude and splintered, was installed on the edge of a bridge, just high enough to stop a stumbling man. These were the first quiet admissions that the greatest dangers often came not from the outside world, but from the very designs of the homes built to protect them. Now, let us move inside those cold stone walls, into a home as the last light of day disappears completely. The world is plunged into a profound, almost total darkness. It is a thick, velvety blackness that we in our modern world of streetlights and glowing screens can scarcely imagine. It is a darkness that feels heavy, a presence in the room. And in this darkness, fire is life. But it is a demanding, a fickle, and a terribly dangerous companion. The air inside is thick with the smell of burning. If the home is a wealthy one, a lord's chamber or a monastery's library, it is the clean, slightly sweet, and ruinously expensive scent of beeswax. Beeswax candles burn clean, bright, and steady. They are a luxury, a symbol of status as much as a source of light. But for most, in a peasant's hut, a modest townsman's home, or the servants' quarters of a castle, the smell is the acrid, greasy, nauseating smell of tallow. Tallow is rendered animal fat, usually from mutton or beef. A tallow candle sputters, it smokes, and it casts a weak, flickering yellow light that seems to make the shadows deeper. It smells constantly of despair, of burning, rancid meat. It is a dim light in every sense of the word. This is the only light, a single, open flame, balanced precariously on a wooden table, or set in a simple iron holder nailed to a wooden wall. And everything in this world is flammable. The heavy wool curtains, hung not for decoration, but to block the relentless icy drafts that rattle the wooden shutters. The tapestries, woven with pride and hung on the cold stone walls to provide insulation. The priceless manuscripts of parchment, meticulously copied by hand, their pages dry as tinder. The straw scattered on the floor for warmth and sanitation, which is itself kindling. The wooden furniture, the thatch and the roof, the very clothes the people wear. A careless elbow at the dinner table, a sudden draft from a poorly sealed window that makes the curtain dance and billow just for a second into the flame. A moment of distraction while reaching for a cup. A person falling asleep, the book or scrap of parchment falling from their hand. And the home, in an instant, becomes a pyre. A sleepy monk, studying late by candlelight, nods off, and the long flowing sleeve of his robe brushes the flame. A woman, combing her long hair before bed, forgets the candle behind her. Entire villages, built of wood and thatch, and whole sections of castles could be, and were, destroyed by a single forgotten candle. They burned with a speed and a finality that we can hardly comprehend. Construction, fire, and reconstruction were the natural, tragic life cycle of medieval architecture. And so, another simple innovation was born of tragedy. The candle guard. A small metal frame, perhaps of simple punched tin for the poor, or ornate, polished brass for the wealthy. It was a tiny cage for a tiny, flickering tyrant. It was a buffer zone, a simple perimeter of just a few inches, designed to keep the flammable, sleeping world at bay. An even greater, more persistent danger was the hearth. In early medieval homes, there was no chimney as we know it. The fire, needed for both warmth and cooking, was simply lit in a shallow pit in the center of the floor. It was, in essence, a bonfire inside a wooden, thatch-roofed house. The logic was simple. Fire provides heat, but the consequence was slow, daily suffocation. The smoke, thick and gray, had nowhere to go. It filled the room from the ceiling down, blackening the walls and rafters with a thick, greasy soot. It stung the eyes until they watered constantly, and it filled the lungs until the air itself was a thick, toxic, acrid haze. Residents coughed, a constant hacking sound. Their lungs were, as one text describes, pickled by the soot. The first chimneys were often just holes, simple ventilation gaps cut into the highest point of the roof. This was a desperate, flawed measure. It let out some of the smoke, but it also let in the rain, the snow, and the very cold the fire was meant to fight. The true innovation, one that fundamentally changed domestic life, was the fireplace hood. A simple, funnel-like structure, often made of stone or plaster and wattle, built above the hearth and tapering up to a proper flue, a chimney that pierced the roof. It was a revolutionary idea, that one could have warmth without suffocation, that a home could be a place of comfort rather than a smoke-filled, tear-inducing trap. This and the nightly curfew bell, from the old French couvre-feu, or cover fire, that rang at sunset, a communal alarm reminding all citizens to extinguish their hearts, were the first desperate attempts at public fire safety. They were the sound of a society slowly, painfully learning to manage the very element that kept it alive. The medieval mind loved height. It was an expression of faith, of power, of ambition. To build upward was to build closer to God. A cathedral spire was a finger pointing to heaven, a physical manifestation of prayer. A castle's tower was a statement of dominance, a panopticon from which a lord could survey his lands and his enemies. And so they built upward with a breathtaking, ambitious, and often reckless abandon. They created soaring towers, delicate, lace-like bell towers, and cathedral spires that seemed to scrape the clouds. But for centuries, this soaring ambition was accompanied by a tragic, almost defiant disregard for the simple, brutal, and unforgiving reality of gravity.
Hundreds of feet in the air, you're perched on scaffolding that is not made of steel pipe and secure platforms. It is made of raw, unfinished timber, lashed together with rope. The planks you stand on are narrow, and they are slick with a fine morning rain, or perhaps a thin, treacherous layer of frost. The wind up here is not a gentle breeze. It is a living thing. It is a constant howling force. It whips your wool tunic against your legs, pushes against you with a steady, invisible hand, and screams in your ears, drowning out the shouts of the foremen on the ground, who are now just tiny moving dots far below.
There are no guardrails. There are no safety harnesses. There is no hard hat. There is only your skill, your balance, your intimate knowledge of the stone, and the yawning, terrible, silent emptiness that waits patiently beneath your feet. You are placing a carved stone, a gargoyle perhaps, guiding it as it's winched up by a rickety, man-powered wooden crane. You lean out just for a second to tap it into its final position. A sudden, violent gust of wind. A moment of dizziness from the height, from the sheer vertiginous drop. A single misplaced foot on a slick, narrow plank, and your life is over. It ends in a long, silent, breathless fall, and a shape on the cathedral stones far below. The construction records from these great Gothic sites are filled with such stories. They are not written with surprise, but with a poetic, somber fatalism. Brother Thomas ascended toward heaven most directly. One monastic ledger reads, "God rest his soul." It was not just the workers. Monks, lost in prayer, lost their balance while cleaning the high, stained glass windows or the stone gargoyles. Priests, waving to the adoring crowds from the bell tower during a festival, leaned too far, overcome with religious fervor. Noble women in the high solar rooms of a castle would stretch from an open, unglazed window to get better light for their tapestry work, lose their balance, and tumble into the courtyard. Every beautiful view, every soaring tower, every testament to God's glory came with a hidden human list of casualties. The solution, when it finally, slowly came, was born not of a sudden collective wave of compassion. It was born of simple, grim practicality. Funerals were expensive. Skilled stonemasons were valuable and difficult to replace. And a steady stream of guests, priests, and valuable employees falling from the balconies was, to put it mildly, bad for morale and bad for the budget. And so, they began to build parapets and stone balustrades. These were at first short, simple walls, the medieval equivalent of a "please don't die here" sign. They were often, bizarrely, built only to knee height, as if the builders had never seen a running child or a stumbling, intoxicated adult. Drunks still tumbled over them. Knights, showing off, would lean too far. But they were a start. They were a concession, a reluctant, stone-carved acknowledgement that human beings were fragile, and that even the most beautiful architecture had to eventually, grudgingly, account for the simple, clumsy, and earthbound bodies that moved within it. Let us turn our attention from the soaring, wind-swept heights to the ground beneath our feet, and the dangers that lay hidden, quietly, within it. Medieval sanitation was a world of guesswork, crossed fingers, and a resigned faith that one's constitution would be strong enough to survive. And the most essential feature of any village, the very heart of the community, was also one of its most deadly: the well. Picture the village green at midday. The well is the center of social life. It is the medieval internet, the place where all news is exchanged, where gossip is born, where reputations are made and broken. It is where women gather, not just to perform the back-breaking labor of drawing water for the day's cooking, washing, and brewing, but to connect, to laugh, and to complain. The sound of the wooden bucket scraping against the stone as it's hauled up on a creaking fibrous rope is the sound of the village's pulse. It is also quite often a gaping, dark, circular hole in the ground. It is lined with rough fieldstone, and it has no fence, no lid, and no warning sign. During the day, under the bright sun, it is a source of life. At night, in the pitch black, it becomes a trap. A child, chasing a strayed animal in the twilight, misjudges the darkness. A traveler, unfamiliar with the village layout, stumbles on his way to the inn. A drunk man, weaving his way home from the alehouse, mistakes the black, silent circle for a shadow. The archives, the coroner's rolls, are full of these small, mundane, domestic tragedies. A chronicler, with the grim, detached humor of the age, might note, "His lordship, once of high standing, now finds himself of considerable depth." The water itself was a constant, lurking paradox. It was essential, but it was also a tomb. When people in the village began to notice the water tasting strange, a little off or oddly sweet, it was a grimly understood code. It meant that another animal, a sheep, a dog, or, as one record complains, a goat in it again, had fallen in and was slowly, horribly decomposing at the bottom, poisoning the water for everyone. The well, the source of life, was now the source of dysentery, of cholera, of death. The innovation that followed was profound in its simplicity. The well cover, a simple, heavy wooden lid or a circular stone slab, was placed across the opening. It was not just about sanitation, though it helped. It was about self-preservation. It was about stopping the endless accidental sacrifices to the town's water source. It was a communal admission that a gaping, dark hole in the middle of a busy town was, perhaps, a bad idea. A similar, though more private, danger existed inside the home, or, more commonly, built into the outer wall of the castle, the privy or the garderobe. This was not a place of comfort or reflection. It was a cold wooden bench, often shared, suspended over a deep, dark, refuse-filled pit, or a long, cold stone chute that emptied directly into the moat below. The drafts were relentless, a blast of icy, foul-smelling air. And these benches, these simple wooden seats, were exposed to constant damp, to rot, and to the ravages of insects and rats. They would, with a terrifying lack of warning, break. There are real, documented records of people, nobles included, who sat down in a moment of necessity and simply fell through. The rotting boards gave way, and they discovered gravity in the most horrific way possible. One unlucky countess, it was reported, met her end mid-thought, plunging several feet into a very undignified afterlife. The solution, again, was born of this fatal, humiliating flaw. Stronger boards, better hinges, and eventually the humble, life-saving toilet lid. It was not for hygiene. It was not for smell. It was a safety device, civilization's earliest do not enter sign, designed to keep people from accidentally falling into their own plumbing. In an age of constant, casual, and brutal violence, protection was not an abstract idea. It was something you wore. It was heavy, it was hot, it was claustrophobic, and it was, in itself, a form of torment. This protection, this shining suit of armor, came at a terrible, debilitating cost. In the early Middle Ages, helmets were, for some, optional. This seems like madness to us, but the logic, it seemed, was theological. There was a strain of fatalistic piety that believed faith was the only helmet a true and pious warrior needed. If God willed you to live, His divine hand would stop the sword. If He willed you to die, a piece of mundane, man-made metal was a grave insult to His divine plan. The battlefields of Europe, littered with the cracked skulls of the faithful, quickly and brutally proved this to be a flawed, if noble, theological position. And so, the first helmet was born. Imagine a simple metal bowl, perhaps with a bar to protect the nose, a nasal helm, hammered into shape by a blacksmith who knew nothing of neurology but plenty about hitting hot metal. It was a brain bucket. Now imagine wearing it. The world shrinks. Your field of vision is reduced to a narrow horizontal slit, as if you are trying to look at the world through a mailbox slot. You cannot see the man charging you from the side. You cannot see the arrow arching down from above. You cannot turn your head. You must turn your entire torso, a slow, clumsy, and vulnerable pivot. Breathing becomes a conscious, labored, and noisy effort. The air you breathe is hot and stale and thick with the metallic smell of your own fear. And the sound is deafening. It is the sound of your own heart, a frantic, muffled drumbeat in your ears. It is the sound of your own ragged, gasping breathing, amplified and trapped in the metal shell with you. When you are struck, even a glancing blow, the clang is not just loud. It is a hollow, skull-rattling, deafening boom that leaves you disoriented, stunned, and momentarily blind. In the High Middle Ages, crusaders wore the great helm, a fully enclosed, flat-topped tin can for the head in the desert heat of the Holy Land. It was a choice of such staggering, unimaginable bravery it borders on madness. The temperature inside the helmet, under the relentless sun, would climb to that of a slow roast. Knights would frequently, and without warning, simply faint mid-battle, collapsing from heat stroke, a victim not the enemy's sword, but of their own protection. Beneath this helmet, the full suit of armor was waging a different, more intimate kind of war on the body. At first, knights wore the heavy, articulated steel plates directly over their linen tunics. The metal chafed the skin raw at the joints, at the neck, and at the waist. Every blow, even if it didn't break the skin, left bruises deep enough to be classified as modern art. The solution was padding. A thick, quilted undergarment called a gambeson was introduced. It was a heavy jacket stuffed with wool or linen scraps or horsehair. This cushioned the blows and, crucially, it absorbed the sweat. But it also trapped heat like a portable wool-lined sauna. In a summer campaign, the knight was, quite literally, poaching himself inside his own armor. He would collapse, not a valiant warrior, but an overheated, dehydrated, and miserable rotisserie chicken. This padding was essential, but it created its own horrifying ecosystem. After a battle, or even just a long day's march, the gambeson was soaked, utterly saturated, in sweat, in blood, and in grime. The smell, trapped within the metal plates, was potent enough to repel a small army. This was the reality of the Shining Knight, claustrophobic, deafened, half-blind, and slowly cooking in a personal, portable, and foul-smelling forge. We have lingered in the physical world, a world of hard edges, sudden falls, suffocating smoke, and suffocating armor. It was a life lived in constant, weary negotiation with the environment, a life where survival was a daily, conscious act. Now, let us drift into a different realm. Let us go to a place enclosed by high, thick, and silent stone walls, a place where the dangers were not to the body, but to the soul, to the heart, and to the mind. Let us go to the medieval convent, and let us listen to the whispers in the cloister. The convent's hidden walls. The sound that marks the day, from before the sun rises in a cold gray sky, to long after it has set in a wash of purple and black, is the bell. It is the convent's heartbeat. It rings for lauds, the first prayer, in the pre-dawn chill, when the stone floors are cold enough to numb the knees. It rings for prime, as the first light appears. It rings for terce, for sext, and for none. It rings for work, for the silent meal in the refectory, for study, for vespers in the fading light, and for Compline in the total darkness, the final prayer before the great silence descends. It is the metronome of a life devoted to God, a life measured not in hours, but in prayers. The air in the convent is cool and still. It smells of beeswax candles, which burn brighter and cleaner than tallow. It smells of old parchment and the sharp, acidic tang of ink. It smells of furniture polish, of herbs from the medicinal garden, and of the plain boiled vegetables and thin soup from the refectory. And always, lingering in the stone of the chapel, is the faint, sweet, and smoky smell of incense. This is a world of women. It is a sanctuary, a haven from the brutalities, the wars, the plagues, and the unpredictable whims of men that defined medieval life. But let us not mistake it for a world of choice. For many of the women who walked these silent, echoing corridors, these walls were not a sanctuary. They were a prison, a very polite, very holy, and very gilded prison. They were the surplus daughters of the nobility, donated to the church not out of a deep, personal, divine calling, but out of cold, hard, and pragmatic arithmetic. A daughter sent to a convent did not require a dowry, that cripplingly expensive bride price that could drain a family's treasury and diminish the inheritance of the eldest son. In a world of primogeniture, where the firstborn son inherited everything, a convent was a convenient and respectable place to store the extra daughters. Some were sent to atone for their father's sins, their lives a living, breathing, lifelong sacrifice for a man's soul. Others were sent because they had no husband, or perhaps because they were difficult. A woman who was too intelligent, too rebellious, too plain, or simply too willful could find herself swiftly enclosed, her voice silenced by a sacred vow she never chose to take. They arrived as children, some as young as 8 or 10, barely old enough to hold a quill or understand the Latin they were forced to chant. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience that they could not possibly understand. They were told they were brides of Christ, but they were, in truth, prisoners of their family's convenience, bound in linen and wool and locked away from the world forever. Life followed a pattern that could, in its endless, unvarying, and relentless repetition, feel like a living death. Silence at meals, listening to a reading from a saint's life. Endless hours of prayer, kneeling on cold stone floors until the knees ached and the mind went numb. Labor in the gardens, in the kitchens, in the infirmary, or in the scriptorium, copying texts letter by painstaking, mind-numbing letter. All of it, every single moment, under the watchful, judging eye of the abbess, a woman who held the power of life and death, of salvation and damnation over her charges. The walls were high enough to block the sun, and any glimpse of the outside world, any lingering thought of it, was considered a sin. This was the gilded cage, and human nature, like ivy, will always find a way to crack the stone. Human nature is a stubborn, resilient thing. It cannot be extinguished by vows, by walls, or by the constant monotonous ringing of a bell. In the crushing silence and profound monotony of the convent, the smallest acts of defiance became profound, life-affirming rebellions. It began quietly, in ways the abbess or the mistress of novices could not easily see or punish. A song hummed in Latin, ostensibly a hymn, but with a suggestive secular undertone. A letter written on a precious,
hoarded scrap of parchment slipped through the cold iron grate of the parlor to a visiting brother or a sympathetic cousin. A whisper in the dormitory long after the great silence had fallen, a shared joke, a moment of forbidden laughter stifled in a rough wool blanket.
In some convents, the rebellion grew bolder, more organized. Nuns who were skilled herbalists in charge of the medicinal and vegetable garden learned the art of fermentation. They brewed wine from grapes or ale from barley, smuggling it in small barrels past the abbess's watchful eye to be shared in a secret, giddy midnight feast.
Others would meet travelers or local priests or handsome young friars in the garden cloisters under the guise of deep spiritual conversation. Some, in the delightful, distracting chaos of a town's feast day, would disguise themselves in borrowed lay clothes, a simple cloak and hood, and sneak into the nearby village, just to feel the sun, the press of a crowd, and the anonymous, intoxicating thrill of freedom for a few precious hours.
In the scriptorium, where nuns copied sacred texts, a different, more permanent kind of rebellion took place. A nun with a sly sense of humor might embroider a secret, subversive message into an altar cloth. Or in the margins of a holy book, a book of hours, she might illuminate a tiny, comical, or even shockingly obscene image. A knight battling a giant snail, a monkey playing the bagpipes, a bishop depicted as a fox. It was a private joke, a small act of creative defiance that would last for centuries. When you live a life of enforced purity and sensory deprivation, even a longing glance exchanged with a confessor, or a deep, passionate, and entirely non-sexual friendship, a special love with another nun, could feel like a revolution. And not all convents were equal. The convents of the poor were harsh, cold, desperate places, where the nuns often suffered from hunger, cold, and profound isolation. But the convents of the wealthy, these resembled miniature all-female courts. They were filled with the daughters of dukes and earls, and they were not about to give up the comforts of their station. These ladies brought their servants with them to do the manual labor. They brought their pets, small dogs, songbirds, and in one notoriously scandalous case, pet peacocks that strutted through the cloisters. They wore fine, soft linen under their rough, scratchy wool habits. They painted their lips with berry juice. They held whispered, lavish feasts in their private chambers. These were small acts, but they were acts of survival. They were ways for these women to feel alive again, to reclaim a piece of the humanity that had been so cruelly and systematically taken from them. Temptation, in a world sealed off from men, a world designed to eradicate carnal thought, almost always arrived wearing the sacred robes of the church. Priests and monks were the only men permitted regular, private access to the nuns. They served as their chaplains, their mass givers, their business managers, and, most intimately, as their spiritual guides and confessors. It is a small, dark space, perhaps a stall in the cold chapel, separated from the priest only by a simple wooden grate. The air is still, smelling of old wood, candle wax, and the faint, lingering scent of the priest's incense. The nun, who may not have spoken to a man in months or even years, kneels in the darkness, and she whispers. She whispers her innermost private thoughts, her sins, her doubts, her fears, her loneliness, her impure thoughts. She confesses the very longings that the convent was built to destroy. The confessor is meant to be a vessel for God, a detached, holy guide to absolve and protect her soul. But he is also a man who himself has taken a vow of celibacy, a man who is also isolated and perhaps lonely. And she is a woman, isolated, vulnerable, and yearning for connection. It is inevitable, a tragic and predictable part of this unnatural system, that these relationships, born in the deepest, most profound spiritual intimacy, would often spiral into something far more physical.
A trembling, fearful voice admitting impure thoughts might be met not with a harsh, divine penance, but with a soft, human whisper of understanding, and then of shared longing.
The records of the time, the bishop's visitation reports, the letters of complaint, the outraged decrees from church councils are full of these scandals. Priests sneaking into convent dormitories at night, secret, well-worn tunnels built and maintained for generations connecting monasteries and nearby nunneries, bribed gatekeepers who would look the other way for a silver coin or a bottle of the convent's hidden wine. Holy fathers, one bitter, disillusioned chronicler wrote, entered not through the gates, but through the heart. These were not just casual, lustful affairs. They were often profound, desperate, and incredibly dangerous connections in a world that forbade them. In letters later discovered by scandalized bishops, hidden behind loose altar panels or tucked into the spines of prayer books, nuns wrote of a love that defied sin, a love they often equated with the divine love of God. I have known the touch of heaven, one such letter, later used in a heresy trial, reads, and it was yours. For them, this forbidden, all-consuming passion was not wickedness. It was salvation from a living death, a moment of warmth in a life of cold stone. But discovery meant ruin, absolute, total, and inescapable ruin. The punishments were brutal. The men might be defrocked, or, if they were well connected, simply reassigned to a remote, undesirable parish. The nuns, however, faced a far darker, more public fate. Their hair was shorn, a mark of deepest shame. They were publicly humiliated, sometimes whipped before the altar, or, in the worst cases, sealed in their cells for life, a sentence of living burial. And yet, the punishment did not erase the desire. It only drove it deeper underground, into a realm of even greater, more desperate secrecy. When desire became too dangerous to express, when the risk of a letter being found or a whisper being overheard was too great, it learned to speak the language of God. In the later Middle Ages, a wave of female mysticism swept across Europe, and it became the perfect, unimpeachable, and holy cloak for everything the church did not want to see, and for every feeling a nun was not allowed to have.
Imagine a nun in the chapel, surrounded by her sisters in the cold, gray, echoing light of dawn. The air is thin with fasting. The hypnotic, droning chant of the liturgy has been going on for hours. Suddenly, one of the sisters falls into a swoon. She trembles, her body arches, she gasps and cries out, her eyes rolled back. She claims that Christ himself has entered her soul, that she is receiving the divine embrace, that she is being pierced by the flaming golden arrow of God's love.
Who would dare question it?
To the other nuns, this was a sign of ultimate holiness, a miracle in their midst. The abbess, far from punishing her, would praise her. The woman becomes a mystic, a local saint, a visionary. Her words are written down. Historians and psychologists still debate this dangerous, blurred, and fascinating line. How many of these ecstatic trances were genuine religious experiences, born of deep faith, fasting, and sensory deprivation? And how many were a form of spiritual theater, a conscious or unconscious performance to mask the physical, carnal realities of a forbidden love affair? The language these mystics used, preserved in their diaries and revelations, is laced with a passion that feels deeply, painfully, and physically human. They wrote of sweet wounds of divine fire, of how my beloved pierced me with his flame, of being drunk on the love of God, of a rapture so intense their bodies could not contain it. Was this theology, or was it a coded, sensual, and brilliant description of a lover's touch? The truth is likely a complex, impenetrable mixture of both. These women were not necessarily liars. They were trapped souls. In an environment of extreme sensory deprivation, of prolonged fasting, and of constant hypnotic prayer, genuine religious ecstasy was a common and well-documented psychological state. But it was also a world where any expression of female desire, any unruly passion, was seen as demonic, a sign of sin. And so, the mystics' trance became the only acceptable language available to them to describe a profound, overwhelming, and life-altering longing, whether that longing was for God or for the priest who heard her confession. The church itself encouraged it at first. A woman lost in rapture was excellent propaganda, proof of God's favor. But when these visions became too sensual, too physical, too uncontrollable, the bishops and inquisitors grew suspicious. Journals were burned, and nuns who were once called saints were suddenly accused of consorting with demons rather than angels. Mysticism was the one form of rebellion that looked from the outside like perfect devotion, and for many it was the only freedom they had ever known. Where there is desire, there are often consequences, and in the cloistered, sealed, and watchful world of the convent, those consequences were impossible to hide forever. The medieval archives, in their dry, bureaucratic language, whisper of pregnancies. They whisper of a creeping, mounting, silent terror as a nun, sworn to a life of chastity, realized her monthly cycle had stopped. They whisper of the desperate, clumsy, and agonizing attempts to conceal a growing belly beneath the heavy, shapeless, and mercifully forgiving folds of a wool habit. But concealment, in a place where everyone lived on top of one another, could only last so long. The whispers of the other nuns, the watchful, knowing, and unforgiving eye of the abbess, the inevitable sickness, the inability to perform the arduous fasts. It would all eventually come out. The discovery was a catastrophe. It was not just a personal sin. It was a communal, spiritual, and financial disaster. It threatened the reputation, the piety, and the very financial survival of the house. A convent known for scandal would receive no more donations from pious nobles and no more daughters and their dowries. What happened next is one of the darkest and most disputed secrets of the medieval church. The bishop's investigations, when they happened, were full of dark rumors of unholy births. One official report from 1320 described a convent where a child was produced by a traveling friar.
The abbess, desperate to save the convent from ruin, claimed the infant was miraculously conceived, a holy child sent by God. The bishop, a pragmatic and worldly man, was not convinced. The baby, the report notes dryly, vanished by nightfall.
When a nun's pregnancy became undeniable, she faced a terrible, impossible choice. Some were forced to carry the child to term in secret in a cold, isolated, locked room, attended only by a midwife sworn to silence. The moment the child was born, it was taken away, to be given to a local orphanage or a peasant family, never to be seen by its mother again.
The darkest rumors, of course, tell of infants who never left the convent walls. They tell of small, secret burials in the herb garden or beneath the flagstones of the cloister, under the cover of night, where only the moon bore witness.
It is crucial and only fair to state that many of these stories were gleefully and wildly exaggerated centuries later by Protestant reformers, eager to paint the Catholic Church as a den of corruption, hypocrisy, and infanticide. It is impossible now, from this great distance, to separate the truth from the propaganda. But the persistence of the rumors, the desperate, angry tone of the bishop's warnings against carnal relations, and the simple, unchangeable facts of human biology suggest that these tragedies did happen. They gave rise to the legends, told in villages for centuries, of ghostly cries echoing in the convent corridors, the lost, unbaptized souls of infants who never saw the light of day. Where history refuses to speak, the earth remembers. When the veil of secrecy finally tore, when a relationship was exposed or a pregnancy became undeniable, the church's punishment was swift, theatrical, and merciless. This was not about forgiveness. It was not about rehabilitation. It was about control. It was divine theater. A brutal, public, and unforgettable warning to any other woman in the convent who dared, even for a moment, to follow her desires. A nun found guilty of fornication could be stripped of her holy habit in front of the entire assembled community, a profound ritual of humiliation. Her hair, her pride, and symbol of womanhood would be crudely shorn from her head, marking her as a sinner. She would be forced to walk barefoot through the nearby town, dressed in a rough penitent's robe, a rope around her neck, while the populace, encouraged by the church, spat, mocked, and threw refuse at her. The most dreaded punishment, however, a punishment reserved for the most scandalous or unrepentant, was immurement. The guilty nun was sealed into a small, windowless stone cell, immured alive. A small slit in the wall was left, just large enough for a crust of bread, a cup of water, and the Holy Communion to be passed through. There, in the total cold, the total dark, and the total silence, she was left to pray until madness or sickness or despair or old age finally took her. The church called it repentance. History calls it cruelty. And always the blame fell harder on the women. The priests or monks involved, especially if they were well connected, were often quietly reassigned to a new, distant parish. Their sins washed away with a private confession and the quiet fraternal influence of their male superiors. And yet, not all nuns bowed their heads in shame. Some convents became quiet, secret hubs of intellectual defiance. Nuns read forbidden books, works of philosophy or secular poetry, smuggled in by sympathetic brothers. They studied the philosophy of Aristotle, and they wrote their own theology, challenging the male-dominated authority of the church. The famous Abbess Hildegard of Bingen, though now a saint, was in her own time a radical. She wrote music. She wrote medical and botanical texts. She wrote visionary theology. And she was repeatedly and harshly reprimanded by her male superiors for preaching publicly and for daring to teach men. Other rebellions were more carnal and bold. Chronicles tell of nuns who simply threw off their habits, scaled the high convent walls at night, and ran away. They ran to join traveling bands of minstrels or to elope with their lovers. A convent in Cologne, Germany, became so notorious for nightly escapes that the exasperated city guard had to be posted at its perimeter, not to keep invaders out, but to keep the nuns in. For every woman who submitted to the cold stone, another whispered her defiance into the night. One condemned sister, before being locked away forever, is said to have told her accuser, "If he did not want us to love, he would not have given us hearts." Her words were erased from the official records, but her spirit and the spirit of countless women like her outlived the stones. This tension, this impossible, unwinnable war between sacred vows and human passion, between public duty and private, all-consuming desire, was not confined to the silence and shadows of the cloister. It played out on the grandest, the brightest, and the most tragic of stages. Let us now turn our gaze from the convent to the court. Let us go to the throne of England, and to the story of a king whose heart, so open and so vulnerable, would cost him his kingdom and his life. The tragedy of King Edward II. To understand the tragedy of King Edward II, we must first and fully understand his father. His father was Edward I, known to history as Longshanks for his great height, and the Hammer of the Scots for his relentless, brutal, and effective warfare. Edward I was the very image, the very archetype of medieval kingship. He was a towering figure, both physically and politically. He was ruthless, commanding, a brilliant military strategist, and a gifted, if stern, administrator. He built the great concentric castles of Wales. He codified English law. His life was war. His language was power. And the sound of his armor striding through a hall was the sound of fear and respect. His son, Edward II, who inherited this heavy iron crown in 1307, was different. He was, like his father, tall, athletic, and strikingly handsome. He was, by all accounts, a physically powerful man. But there the resemblance ended. He had none of his father's grim, iron-willed intensity. He had no taste for the hunt, for the tournament, or for the grim business of war. He preferred music to the sound of war drums, laughter to sermons, and artistry to administration. And to the profound, almost unspeakable, and constant humiliation of his court, he preferred manual labor to the duties of state. The barons, grim, powerful, warrior princes who defined themselves by their land, their lineage, and their prowess with a sword, would whisper in open horror as they saw their king, the anointed monarch of England, God's chosen ruler, laughing and working alongside common masons, thatchers, blacksmiths, and rowers. He loved to swim, which was seen as a common and slightly bizarre pastime. He loved to build walls. He loved to dig ditches. He loved to shoe horses. He loved the company of blacksmiths and fishermen, finding in their simple, practical skills a value he could not find in the fawning, complex world of court politics. To the rigid, hierarchical, and deeply snobbish mind of the nobility, this was not humility. It was a perversion. It was an abdication of his divine status. It was a daily, public humiliation to every earl and duke who was forced to bow on bended knee to a man who, given the choice, would rather be hauling stones or thatching a roof. Edward II was an emotional man, a man of intense, almost modern sensibilities. He was drawn to loyalty, to beauty, and to intensity in others. He was a man who needed to love and to be loved with a singular, consuming, and blinding passion. He was, in almost every way, a man hopelessly out of step with his time. A sensitive, artistic soul born to wear a crown of iron. And his heart, so open, so loyal, and so demanding, would be his ruin. The object of this singular, all-consuming passion was a knight from Gascony named Piers Gaveston. He was not born into greatness. He was the son of a minor, respectable knight, but he had risen through the royal household on the sheer, undeniable strength of his charm, his talent, his quick wit, and a dangerous, magnetic, and ultimately fatal arrogance. He had been a companion to the young Edward when he was Prince of Wales, and from the moment they met, something sparked. Gaveston was everything the stiff, formal, and grim English court was not. He was bold, he was funny, he was irreverent, a breath of fresh southern air. He made the prince laugh, a sound not often heard. He teased him, he challenged him. He treated him with an intoxicating, brotherly familiarity that no fawning, bowing English noble ever dared. In a world of cold, ritualized formality, Gaveston was real. He was warm, and he was exciting. Edward II, even as prince, adored him. Chroniclers of the time, struggling to describe the depth of their bond, a bond that so clearly eclipsed Edward's relationship with his own arranged wife, Isabella of France, simply called it love. They wrote, with shock, that the king loved another man more than his wife, and that he was bewitched by him. When Edward became king, one of his very first acts was to recall Gaveston, whom his father, Edward I, had seen as a corrupting influence and had prudently banished. But Edward II did not just recall him, he showered him. He showered him with titles, with jewels, with lands, with estates that should have gone, by custom, to England's most powerful lords. The ultimate insult, the one that crossed every line of political decency and signaled a revolution in the king's priorities, came when Edward made Gaveston the Earl of Cornwall. This was not just any title. The earldom of Cornwall was a sacred, almost royal gift. It was a title traditionally reserved only for royalty, for a prince of the blood. To give it to a low-born foreigner, a common knight, a man seen as little more than a royal plaything, was an unmistakable statement. It was a political, an economic, and a deeply symbolic outrage. It was a slap in the face to every baron, earl, and duke in the kingdom. Edward did not care. He called Gaveston his brother, his dearest. They were inseparable. They reportedly dined from the same plate and wore matching clothes. The court seethed. England had seen cruel kings, and foolish kings, and even mad kings. But it had never seen a king who so openly, so flagrantly, seemed to love another man more than his own crown, his own queen, and his own kingdom. Piers Gaveston, for his part, did nothing to calm the situation. He was not a quiet or grateful recipient of the king's favor. His newfound power, his absolute proximity to the king, made him impossibly, suicidally arrogant. He strutted through court in silks and jewels finer than the king's. But his greatest sin was his wit. He was funny, and his humor was cruel. He gave the great, grim, powerful, and proud lords of England cruel and humiliating nicknames. Thomas of Lancaster, the king's cousin and one of the most powerful and wealthiest men in the realm, he called the Fiddler or the Churl. The Earl of Lincoln, an old and respected statesman, he called Burstbelly. And Guy de Beauchamp, the powerful, stern, and dangerous Earl of Warwick, he called the Black Dog of Arden. These were not just private whisper jokes. They were public mockery, delivered with a smirk, and they were political suicide.
The Black Dog of Warwick would not forget. "Let him call me dog," Warwick snarled to his allies, "for one day this dog will bite him."
The cycle of Gaveston's fate began. The furious barons, led by men like Warwick and Lancaster, united against him. They saw him as a cancer on the kingdom, a foreign parasite who corrupted the king and stole the wealth of the realm. They banded together, a political faction, and in 1311 they forced the king to sign a set of ordinances. These were reforms that limited royal power, but their primary goal was one thing: the permanent, non-negotiable exile of Piers Gaveston. Edward agreed, his heart broken. Chroniclers say he wept openly as Gaveston departed for the continent. "My brother," he wrote in his letters, "return to me soon." And he always did. Edward was a man in the grip of an obsession. He could not bear the separation. He would recall Gaveston violating the sacred ordinances, defying his parliament, and daring his barons to act. This cycle repeated, each recall deepening the constitutional crisis and the barons' white-hot, murderous hatred. In 1312, the Black Dog finally bit. While the king was away, the barons, led by Warwick, captured Gaveston at Scarborough Castle. Edward, in a panic, begged for his life. He sent frantic letters. He sent envoys. He promised them anything, any concession, if they would just spare his friend. But it was too late. The barons' hatred was too deep, their humiliation too public, their fear of his return too great. At Warwick Castle, Piers Gaveston was condemned in a mockery of a trial. On a gray June morning, he was led to a place called Blacklow Hill, a piece of land owned by the Earl of Lancaster. There, without the king's permission, without any legal authority, they ran him through with a sword and beheaded him. It was not an execution, it was an assassination. When the news reached Edward, his grief was so profound it terrified the court. It was a grief that, over time, would curdle into a cold, patient, and unyielding fury, a desire for vengeance that would poison the rest of his reign. After Gaveston's brutal death, there was a void in the king's life, and a quiet, simmering, undeclared civil war. For a time, it seemed Edward might reconcile with his barons, the men who had so brutally murdered his friend. He even tried to rule with them, forced into an uneasy truce. But Edward was a man who needed a singular focus for his affection, his trust, and his loyalty. And he found it, this time, in a pair of men, Hugh Despenser the elder and his ambitious, cunning son, Hugh Despenser the younger. This new relationship was different, and in many ways, far more dangerous for the kingdom. The Despensers were not foreign-born like Gaveston. They were powerful, established English nobility. They were not just charming court favorites. They were politically astute, ambitious, and utterly, profoundly ruthless. Where Gaveston had been an arrogant, personal insult, the Despensers were a systematic, structural plague. Hugh Despenser the Younger, in particular, captured the king's affection and his absolute, unwavering loyalty. And together, they used the king's power, the royal seal itself, as a personal weapon. They were not just favorites, they were partners in tyranny. After Edward finally defeated his baronial enemies at the Battle of Boroughbridge, a victory that was, for him, sweet vengeance for Gaveston's death, his power and the Despensers' power became absolute. They seized lands from their rivals. They destroyed their enemies in the courts. They manipulated the law, extorted money, and amassed a fortune and a portfolio of estates that dwarfed all others. This was not just about love or friendship. It was about cold, hard, systematic greed and power. And the person who felt this new, cold reality most keenly was Edward's wife, Queen Isabella. She was the daughter of the powerful King of France, known as Isabella the Fair for her legendary beauty. She had already endured the profound public humiliation of being ignored and sidelined in favor of Piers Gaveston. At her own coronation, Edward had famously spent the entire time lavishing attention and gifts on Gaveston, ignoring his new 12-year-old bride. Now, she was being replaced again, but this time it was far worse. The Despensers saw her not as an irrelevance, but as a political rifle. They systematically, and with the king's full approval, stripped her of her lands. They stripped her of her income. They even took away her children, placing them in the care of Despenser allies. They reduced her to a queen in name only, a virtual prisoner in her own court, powerless, impoverished, and deeply, deeply afraid. For Isabella, this was no longer just an insult. It was a threat to her survival. And she began to wait, with a cold, patient, and calculating fury for her chance. In 1325, Edward and the Despensers made a fatal, arrogant mistake. A political dispute had arisen with France over the territory of Gascony. They needed a high-level negotiator. Who better, they thought, than the king's own wife, Isabella, sister to the new French king, Charles IV. It seemed like a brilliant move. It would get her out of the way, and her family ties would surely help the negotiations. It was the single greatest, most catastrophic miscalculation of Edward's reign. Once on her own soil, safe from her husband, safe from the Despensers, and surrounded by the power and sympathy of the French court, Isabella was transformed. She was no longer the victim. She was a player. She refused to return. She issued a public declaration, a stunning act of defiance that echoed with shock through every court in Christendom. She would not set foot in England, she said, while that man Despenser stands beside her husband. She painted herself brilliantly as the wronged wife, forced into exile by the evil counselors who had bewitched her husband. And then, in Paris, she did something no medieval queen had ever dared. She began to gather an army. She was not alone. She found a powerful, charismatic, and notorious ally. His name was Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron from the Welsh Marches and a bitter, sworn enemy of the Despensers. He had been imprisoned by Edward in the Tower of London, but had made a daring, almost miraculous escape. reportedly by drugging his guards, and had fled to France. He and Isabella met. Their shared burning hatred for the Despensers and their shared contempt for the king they felt had betrayed them blossomed into a powerful political alliance. And very quickly, that alliance became a personal one. They became lovers, their scandalous open affair the talk of Europe. This was not just a political coup. This was personal vengeance, wrapped in the robes of righteous justice. Isabella, the humiliated wife, the impoverished queen, was returning. She betrothed her young son, Prince Edward, whom she had convinced Edward to send over to pay homage to the French king, to a foreign princess in exchange for ships and mercenaries. She was no longer the quiet, ignored Isabella the Fair. She was the she-wolf of France, and she was coming to destroy her husband's favorites and to take his crown. When Isabella and Roger Mortimer landed in England in the autumn of 1326, the kingdom collapsed like a house of cards. This was not a war. It was a procession. The nobles, who had long despised the Despensers for their greed, their tyranny, and their low status in the case of the elder Despenser, flocked to her banner. The city of London, which had suffered under the Despensers' financial schemes, opened its gates to her and rioted in her name, capturing and beheading any Despenser ally they could find. Edward II's power, which had seemed so absolute just months before, dissolved overnight. He was abandoned by everyone. He and Hugh Despenser the Younger were forced to flee, becoming fugitives in their own kingdom. They were hunted across the Welsh marches, their own lands, disguised, terrified, wet, and cold. They were finally captured near Neath in South Wales, betrayed by their own servants. For the king, the end was humiliation. For Hugh Despenser the Younger, it was hell. Despenser was dragged to the city of Hereford to face Queen Isabella. The man who had ruled England through terror and greed, who had humiliated the queen and stolen her children, was now her prisoner. His trial was a formality. His execution was a masterpiece of symbolic, public, and brutal vengeance. He was accused of being a traitor, a heretic, and a sodomite. He was stripped, and a mocking crown of nettles was placed on his head. He was tied to a ladder, and in full view of the jeering crowd, and, some sources say, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer themselves, he was hanged but cut down while still alive. He was tied to a table. He was castrated, and then he was disemboweled, his entrails pulled out and burned before his own eyes. His body was quartered, his head cut off and nailed to London Bridge. It was a message. As for Edward, he was taken to Kenilworth Castle. He was a prisoner, his spirit broken. In January 1327, in a cold, formal, and legally terrifying ceremony, Parliament formally deposed him. A delegation of bishops, earls, and barons read a long list of his crimes: his favoritism, his loss of Scotland, his incompetence, his failure to rule. They declared he was no longer king. Stripped of his crown and royal robes, the king sat in chains as his own 14-year-old son, Edward III, was declared the new king. The deposed monarch, it was reported, wept. His reign was over. His tragedy, however, was just beginning. A fallen king is a dangerous thing. He is a living symbol for rebellion, a rallying point for all who are discontented. Isabella and Roger Mortimer, now ruling England in the young king's name, knew this better than anyone. Edward II, now just Edward of Carnarvon, was moved from one fortress to another, his location kept a closely guarded secret. Finally, he was delivered to the grim, damp, and isolated stronghold of Berkeley Castle, a fortress in Gloucestershire surrounded by swamps and guarded by men loyal to Roger Mortimer. At first, Isabella, with a pretense of mercy, claimed she wished her husband to be kept in safety and comfort. But the reports that trickled out, whispered by sympathetic servants and fearful locals, told a different, darker story. Locals whispered that the king was being kept not in a royal apartment, but in a cold, dark cell in the dungeon. They said he was being tormented psychologically by his guards, who would shout and hammer on his door at all hours to prevent him from sleeping. The most gruesome and persistent rumors claimed that the corpses of dead animals were thrown into a pit, a charnel house, in the cell directly below his, in the hopes that the stench, the disease, and the despair would kill him, making it look natural. But Edward, despite his sensitive nature, was physically strong. He endured. An attempt to free him, plotted by loyalist monks, failed. This, it seems, terrified Isabella and Mortimer. As long as Edward lived, their hold on power, their very lives, were insecure. A cryptic, coded message was allegedly sent to the castle's keepers. It was a sentence in Latin, perfectly balanced. Edwardumum occidere nolite timere bonum est. It was a message of perfect, deadly, and deniable ambiguity. Read with the comma after nolate, do not, it meant, do not kill Edward, it is good to be afraid. But read with the comma after timere, to be afraid, it meant, do not be afraid to kill Edward, it is good. The meaning was clear. Kill him, but leave no mark. What happened next, on the night of September 21st, 1327, became one of history's darkest and most infamous mysteries. The official story was that the king died of natural causes, that he was overcome by a surfeit of grief. But a far more gruesome, specific, and horrifying legend soon spread, a legend that chroniclers wrote down as fact. The legend, which we must treat as a legend, was that on that September night, the king's screams were heard for miles around the castle, shrieks of agonizing pain that woke the entire village. It claimed he was pinned down, and a red-hot poker, heated in the fireplace, was inserted into his body through a horn to kill him from within, leaving no outward mark. It was a death, if true, of horrific symbolic cruelty, a punishment meant to mock the king's rumored passions. Whatever the truth, a poker, or, far more likely, quiet, brutal strangulation or suffocation with a heavy mattress, by morning, Edward II was dead. His body was put on public display, his face, they said, contorted in an agony that belied the story of a peaceful, natural death. Isabella and Roger Mortimer now ruled England. Their power, built on betrayal and murder, was absolute. They lived in open, lavish luxury, hosting grand tournaments, their greed now rivaling and perhaps even exceeding that of the dispensers they had overthrown. But they were haunted. Almost immediately, rumors began to spread that the body at the funeral was not the king's, that the face was too disfigured or, in some versions, too peaceful to be recognized, that the coffin was sealed. Rumors, persistent and powerful, began to spread that Edward had, in fact, survived. Sightings were reported. a hermit in the Welsh mountains, a man in Ireland calling himself William the Carpenter, a wandering penitent in Germany. Most of these were likely just hopeful myths, the refusal of a populace to believe that a divinely anointed king could be so brutally murdered. But one piece of evidence, one profound historical puzzle, lingers. It is called the Fieschi Letter, a document discovered centuries later in a French archive. It was written by a papal envoy, Manuele Fieschi, to King Edward III, Edward II's son. In the letter, Fieschi claims that his predecessor had heard a deathbed confession from a man claiming to be Edward II. This man claimed that a servant, pitying him, had murdered a guard and that the guard's body was the one presented at the funeral. He claimed he had escaped Berkeley Castle with the help of this servant, had fled to Ireland, then to France, and was living out his days as a penitent hermit in a monastery in Italy. Penitent, bearded, and broken, yet at peace. We will never know the truth. Was it an elaborate hoax? A political plan by Edward III's enemies? Or the most incredible survival story in royal history? We do know that Isabella and Mortimer acted like people being haunted. They avoided the subject of Edward's death. Isabella built a lavish shrine for his soul, but she never visited it. Their reign of terror, however, was short. The young Edward III was not his father. He was his grandfather's grandson, ruthless, proud, cunning, and a warrior. He had been a pawn, but he would not remain one. In 1330, at the age of 17, he staged a daring, brilliant coup. His loyal men crept through a secret, long-forgotten tunnel that ran under Nottingham Castle. They burst into the royal apartments and seized Roger Mortimer right in front of the Queen. Isabella, the she-wolf, famously, tragically, screamed, "Fair son, have pity on the gentle Mortimer." Her son had no pity. Roger Mortimer was tried as a traitor and hanged at Tyburn, his body left to rot on the gibbet for days. Isabella was spared execution. She was, after all, his mother. But her power was broken, completely and forever. Her son confined her to a comfortable, luxurious exile at Castle Rising, where she lived for another 28 years, her sanity slowly fraying, haunted by the ghosts of her husband and her lover. The tragedy, born of a king's forbidden, obsessive love, had finally, bloodily, come to an end. The tragedy of Edward and Isabella was a royal marriage undone by a love that was present, a destructive, all-consuming love for another that eclipsed all duty, all custom, and all sense. Let us now drift across the channel to another kingdom and another royal marriage. This one was undone not by the presence of a forbidden love, but by its sudden, its total, its absolute, and its terrifying, inexplicable absence. The repudiated queen. In the year 1193, Paris was a city of celebration. Its king, Philip II, known as Augustus, was one of the most powerful and calculating monarchs in Europe. He was not a man given to fits of passion and public emotion like Edward II. He was a political genius, a pragmatist, a builder, a strategist, a man who was methodically, piece by piece, forging the modern nation of France. He was a man defined by his self-control. His first wife, Isabella of Hainaut, had died young, leaving him with a male heir but without a queen. After a respectable period of mourning, he began to search for a new wife. The match, as all royal matches were, was one of pure politics. The choice fell on Princess Ingeborg of Denmark, the sister of the powerful Danish king Canute VI. She was 18 years old, and by all accounts was known for her grace, her deep piety, and her great beauty. The alliance was a strategic masterstroke for Philip. It would secure peace with the North. It would bring a massive dowry of 10,000 silver marks. And, most intriguingly to the ambitious Philip, it gave him a very questionable, very thin, ancestral claim to the throne of England via the old Danish line. It was a useful political threat to hold over his rival, King Richard the Lionheart. Princess Ingeborg, young and hopeful, embarked on the long, arduous, and frightening journey from Denmark to France. She was leaving everything she had ever known, her family, her language, her home, to become the queen of the most powerful court in Europe. She was, in essence, a political sacrifice, a living piece of a treaty. The wedding, held at the great cathedral in Amiens on August 14, 1193, was magnificent. The cathedral echoed with choirs. The nobles of France, in all their splendor, gathered to see their new queen. King Philip, handsome, commanding, and at the height of his power, greeted his bride. Chroniclers, present at the ceremony, wrote that he seemed pleased, that he found her beautiful, and that all was as it should be. To all who watched, it was the dawn of a glorious new partnership, a union blessed by God and guided by the sharp political mind of the king. But by the next morning, that illusion was shattered into 1,000 pieces. The next day, August 15th, was meant to be Ingeborg's formal coronation. She was to be anointed with holy oil and crowned Queen of France. The court gathered again. The bishops were in place. But something had gone terribly, inexplicably wrong. When King Philip arrived, he was not the confident, pleased monarch of the day before. His face was ashen. He was visibly, physically trembling. He refused to speak to his new wife. He would not, or could not, even look at her. Before the coronation ceremony could even begin, Philip summoned his bishops and declared, in a voice shaking with what chroniclers could only describe as horror, that the marriage must be annulled immediately. The court was stunned into a cold, shocked silence. The Danish ambassadors were furious, demanding to know what crime, what insult, what hidden flaw their princess had committed. Ingeborg herself, 18 years old, in a foreign country, not speaking a word of the language, surrounded by hostile strangers, was utterly and publicly humiliated. She wept before the altar, begging her new husband, through terrified interpreters, to remember his holy vows. Philip turned away from her. He gave no clear explanation. He claimed he had been bewitched. He claimed that an evil had come between them, that something unnatural had occurred that night. He muttered to his courtiers that he was bound by evil, that a spell had been cast on him. What could have happened? What could have transpired in the privacy of the royal bedchamber to provoke such an instant, violent, and total revulsion in one of the most calculating and self-controlled men in Europe? History offers no answer, only theories. Some say it was political, that overnight Philip received sudden, secret news that made the Danish alliance useless, and he needed to get out of it immediately. This seems unlikely,
The reaction was too personal, too visceral, too full of horror.
Some say it was physical, that he was, for some reason, suddenly and completely repulsed by her. Was it a blemish, a scar hidden by her robes, a physical deformity he had not been told about? Or, as some have morbidly speculated, was it something as simple and as human as her bad breath? Or was it something deeper, something psychological, a sudden, inexplicable superstitious terror, a holy panic, a genuine paranoid belief that he had been cursed, that this woman was a source of spiritual contamination, and that to stay married to her would mean his damnation or his death? We will never know. The mystery is absolute, and it is the heart of the tragedy. The wedding feast was canceled. The gifts were withdrawn, and Ingeborg, the newly married Queen of France, was locked away in a convent, a prisoner, before she had even worn the crown. King Philip II was a man obsessed. He was used to getting his way, and he would not be thwarted by a terrified 18-year-old girl. He was determined to erase this marriage from history. He gathered a council of compliant, frightened French bishops and forced them to dissolve the marriage. They used the laughably thin and likely fabricated legal excuse that he and Ingeborg were somehow distantly related, sixth cousins or some such, and had thus violated the complex church laws of consanguinity. The marriage was declared void. Philip was, in his own mind, a free man. But from her confinement in the convent, Ingeborg refused to accept it. She was not the passive, weeping victim Philip had assumed. She was isolated, she was terrified, and she was homesick. But she was also intelligent, deeply pious, and remarkably strong. She did not know French, but she had learned 2 words, and she repeated them over and over to any priest, any nun, any visitor who would listen. Mala Francia, evil France, and Roma, Roma, Rome, Rome. She was appealing to the Pope. Her letter to Pope Celestine III was bold, clear, and defiant. She accused King Philip of lying before God. She insisted the marriage had been lawful and, crucially, that it had been consummated on their wedding night. "I am his wife before God," she declared, "and nothing but death will part us." The Pope, intrigued and outraged by Philip's high-handedness, agreed with her. He ruled the marriage was valid and commanded King Philip to take his wife back. Philip's response was an act of staggering public defiance. He simply ignored the Pope. He doubled down. And then, while Ingeborg, his legal living wife, was still a prisoner, he married again. His new choice was Agnes of Morania, a beautiful Bavarian noblewoman. And by all accounts, Philip adored her. He was smitten. He called her his true and blessed wife, and she soon bore him 2 children. He had, in essence, simply replaced Ingeborg. To the church, this was not a marriage. It was public, defiant, royal bigamy. It was a mortal sin. And it was a direct, arrogant challenge to the spiritual authority of Rome, a challenge that could not and would not be ignored. King Philip had defied one pope, Celestine III, who was old, tired, and hesitant to pick a fight with the most powerful king in Europe. But in 1198, Philip would have to face a new pope, and this new pope was a man of a very different character. His name was Innocent III. He was not a frail spiritualist. He was a lawyer pope, a brilliant, cold and utterly ruthless administrator who believed with all his soul in the absolute supremacy of the papacy. He believed the papacy was the sun, and all kings and emperors were merely the moon, reflecting his divine, God-given light. When Innocent III learned that the King of France was living openly in sin with a concubine, as he called Agnes, while his lawful, God-given queen languished in a prison convent, he was enraged. This was an affront to God, a mockery of the holy sacrament of marriage, and a direct threat to papal authority. His letters to Philip were not requests. They were sharp, uncompromising, and cold commands. "You are not above God," he wrote, "nor beyond the reach of his justice." He gave Philip a clear ultimatum: release Ingeborg from her prison, dismiss Agnes of Moravia from the court, and restore the Queen of Denmark to her rightful place, or France itself would suffer. Philip, still infatuated with Agnes and stubbornly proud, hesitated. He tried to negotiate. He stalled. He defied. Innocent was not bluffing. In the year 1200, Pope Innocent III placed the entire Kingdom of France under interdict. It is hard for us, in a secular age, to imagine the sheer existential and communal terror this caused. The interdict was a spiritual blockade. It meant that all church services everywhere in the kingdom stopped. The bells, which marked the time of day and called people to prayer, fell silent. The churches were locked. No one could be married. No one could receive communion. No one could make their final dying confession. And, most terrifying of all, the dead could not be given a Christian burial. They were buried in unconsecrated ground, in ditches like animals, their souls, it was believed, lost to damnation forever. The people of France panicked. The economy ground to a halt. The unburied dead became a health crisis. Peasants, nobles, and bishops alike whispered that God had abandoned them, that their king had led them into spiritual darkness, all for a woman he refused to look at. The barons, fearing for their souls and the stability of the kingdom, began to rebel, not against God, but against their king. Philip's kingdom was collapsing, not from an invading army, but from a profound, terrifying, and silent spiritual void. Under this crushing, total, and unrelenting pressure, King Philip II, the great Augustus, the master strategist, finally broke. He could not fight his own people, his own nobles, and God all at the same time. He relented. He agreed to dismiss the heartbroken Agnes of Moravia, who, by then, had borne him 2 children, whom the Pope, in a compromise, agreed to legitimize. He sent her away from court. And he ordered that Ingeborg be freed from her confinement. But the reunion was a mockery. It was a cold, bitter political charade. When Ingeborg, pale, thin, but profoundly dignified, was brought before him, chroniclers say the king trembled with his old, inexplicable revulsion and muttered to his aides that he could not bear her presence. He had obeyed the Pope, but his heart was unchanged. The interdict was lifted. The bells of France rang out once more. The people rejoiced. But for Ingeborg, the nightmare simply changed shape. Philip refused to live with her as his wife. He refused to share her chambers. He refused to see her. The moment the Pope's attention was elsewhere, he sent her to a remote, isolated fortress, a prisoner once more under the guise of royal protection. Agnes of Merania, his beloved, died soon after, some say of a broken heart from the humiliation and exile. Philip grieved for her deeply, and many historians believe he blamed Ingeborg for her death, his hatred for the queen deepening from a strange horror into a cold, permanent, and bitter resentment. And so, Ingeborg waited. For nearly 20 years, she lived in this gilded, lonely exile. She was the Queen of France, and yet she was a prisoner. She was moved from castle to keep her isolated and out of the public eye. But she did not break. She continued to write letters. Letters to Rome, letters to her brother in Denmark, and even letters to Philip himself. Her letters are masterpieces of human endurance. They are not angry. They are not hateful. They are pious, they are patient, and they are relentlessly, stubbornly, and brilliantly firm. She forgave him for his cruelty. She prayed for his soul. And she never, ever, not for one moment, wavered from her central, unshakable claim. I am your wife. I am your queen, before God. She became a symbol across Europe, a model of Christian patience and piety. She was the woman who, with nothing but her faith, her dignity, and her quill, was waging a quiet, lonely, cold war against the most powerful king in Christendom. Decades passed. Ingeborg grew from a girl of 18 into a woman of 20, then 30. She spent her youth in confinement. Then, in the year 1213, 20 years after that disastrous, inexplicable wedding day, King Philip II, now older, hardened by war, and at the very height of his power, suddenly announced that Ingeborg would be restored to full royal honor. The court was astonished. Why now? Had his heart finally softened after 2 decades? Had his conscience, haunted by the ghost of his beloved Agnes and the relentless, dignified piety of Ingeborg, finally won? Or was it, as is far more likely, a cold, final, political calculation? Philip was planning a major war, an invasion of England. He desperately needed the absolute, unwavering support of the Pope. And the one final, lingering piece of business, the one sin the Pope had never truly forgiven, was the mistreatment of Ingeborg. The Danish alliance and its fleet was also suddenly useful again. And so Ingeborg was brought back to court, this time for real. She was no longer the frightened girl. She was a woman in her late 30s, pale, fragile, and marked by her long, lonely isolation. But she was serene. She was victorious. King Philip, now an old man, greeted her with formality. This was not a loving reunion. It was an armistice. He treated her with the cold, distant, and correct respect due to her station. They rarely met, but she was, at last, the queen. Her triumph was undeniable. She had survived. She had survived imprisonment, she had defied an annulment, and she had outlived her beautiful, beloved rival. Her unwavering faith, her patient, stubborn, and quiet endurance had bent a king, outlasted a generation of scandals, and forced history to acknowledge her. When Philip II died in 1223, Ingeborg did not attend his funeral, but she prayed for his soul. She lived on for another 14 years, long into the reign of her stepson. She was treated, finally, with genuine respect, honor, and even affection by the royal family. She devoted her massive fortune not to jewels or power, but to founding churches and aiding the poor. Her vengeance was not loud. Her vengeance was her survival. The woman whom a king had tried to erase from history became the woman who conquered his conscience, and in the end triumphed, not through war or passion, but through faith and through patience.
The bells of the convent are silent now. The torches in the great hall have long since burned out, and the moats have turned to dry earth. The castles of Edward and Philip are quiet, their tragedies now just whispers, faint as mist, in the cold ancient stone.
We have drifted through their world, a world defined by its vulnerability. The vulnerability of the body to a splintered railing, a patch of wet stone, or a length of heavy wool. The vulnerability of the soul to a whispered temptation in the dark. The vulnerability of a great king to a destructive love that cost him his crown. And the vulnerability of a patient queen to a mysterious, silent hatred she could never understand.
Their lives, trapped in old parchment and whispered, conflicting rumors, feel impossibly distant, and yet the echo of their humanity remains. The desire to be safe, the need to love, the pain of betrayal, and the quiet, stubborn, and remarkable will to endure.
Their stories are over. Their struggles are done. And for you, the night is peaceful. You are safe in the comfort of your room, surrounded by a stillness, a safety, and a quiet that they could only have dreamed of. There is nothing left to do but to let these echoes fade, to feel the comfort of the present moment, and to allow yourself, finally, to drift into a deep and peaceful sleep.